Hey, what's going on? Eric Bach, your host of the Look Right Naked podcast. And today I sit down with my man, Brad Dieter. He is a PhD, a master's of science, a scientist, and entrepreneur whose goal is to bring science and industry together to improve human health and well-being. I have known Brad for years. We talk about going back in the day to 2011 when we were both kind of getting started in the fitness industry. Because today, Brad is a leader in the fields of health, wellness, and applied biotechnology. He currently serves as the Chief Operating Officer of Macros Inc. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Ethoderm and sits on the Scientific Advisory Board for the National Academy of Sports Medicine, which happens to be one of the top 3 certification companies that are out there for personal trainers. So Brad is both in the trenches in terms of as a coach. He is an executive level businessman, and he's also serving in these advisory roles that help really determine a lot of the education and quality of information that is going out to improve the industry today. And we do a deep dive on nutrition. Not only things are going to help you look great naked, but understanding the difference between maybe optimizing your nutrition for aesthetics and doing so for health. In addition, we're going to dig into a couple of rapid fire questions in regards to his favorite supplements, the one meal he would eat if he was on death row, and many other pieces of helpful advice. So check out this episode. And if you find it valuable, please make sure that you drop us a 5-star review and drop us a comment if you're catching us on YouTube. The young OGs of online fitness to an extent.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. I was having a conversation with one of our coaches the other day, and I was like, yeah, I mean, I started doing online coaching in 2011, probably. So that was really kind of first wave of people to really start doing it. And it's kind of crazy how so many people have come and gone, but there's still probably, 15, 20 people who still have built really impressive careers and have done a lot of great things.
Yeah, I find it to be an interesting field in that, you get some people who jump in, they stick with it, and they just continue to double down. But an interesting thing is in the world of business development and entrepreneurship, when you start building a business, you start to realize that there are different skill sets you need to develop and to build. And in many cases, people will maybe start with something that's a passion project, using fitness as an easy example. I want to coach people. And then they learn, okay, well, in order to coach people, I need to become a better communicator. And then they become maybe somebody who does more stuff in the world of sales or persuasion, or somebody learns like, oh, I have to learn how to actually build a business and understand the tech side of things. And then they become really technically good at something like web development, and that builds a whole nother career, right? And to me, it's like, it highlights the importance of just get going in any action that you're looking to take, and the path starts to become clear. Maybe the destination you previously had or the goal that you previously had leads you to something else that is entirely different, but it still fulfills like the happiness that you're looking for, the income that you're looking for in these different areas. And so it just kind of highlights the importance of like just getting going, even when you don't have all the answers, and then the path will become clear over time.
Yeah, I think, one of the best pieces of advice I was given early in my career is the name of the game is to just stay in the game, because you never know what opportunities are going to pop up. You don't know what skills you're going to build along the way. And the longer you just get to keep chipping away at it, like the higher your likelihood of success comes. And you may not know what avenue it's going to look like what is the end result, but you're always there in the position to take advantage of something when it pops up. Yeah,
that's a great way to think about it, right? It's like consistency in anything really becomes that most important factor. It's funny because you see, especially in the online world, you see like all these business coaches and how to be a 7-figure coach, how to hit 6 figures a month and all these different things. And so similar to fitness, people get this warped idea of like how fast they can accomplish something because they see a case study of somebody who blew up, because they went viral on social media, whatever it is, right? And had a mentor, I think this is Vince Del Monte. He's like, listen, like if you have like an income goal, does it really make a difference if you hit that now or in 10 years? Because staying in the game long term is really what it comes down to for longevity in anything. And I think the same approach really is helpful in the world of fitness, because we live in such a society now where it's instant gratification, which again, people talk about this shit all the time, but like this instant gratification, this idea that we're going to have the results immediately, leads so many people to get distracted from like the underlying principles and the key things they need to be able to focus on to actually get the result, that it feels like they try everything in a world where there's like a wealth of knowledge, but a lack of wisdom in how to apply things.
Yeah, the compound effect of continuing to do the same thing for a long period of time and not worrying about what the result is today versus 10 years from now is, I just think people don't have the patience to sit through and wait for that outcome. And I think the hardest part is if you don't learn that at a young age, like it's really hard to learn that as an adult, because I think a lot of it is like an experiential knowledge of, unless you've ever had like the win that comes from the end of the compounding, you never know what actually comes true. So you're always like, hey, I've never actually seen this happen, so I don't think it's ever going to happen. And so I think that's a big part of why a lot of people struggle is they never get the experiential knowledge of what that win feels like and what it is. So they just never learn that skill.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? I mean, you can, again, the easy example is you have a testimonial, or you see the results that somebody else got and you're like, oh, that's really cool, but I've tried all these things and I've failed and I just can't do it. Like it just won't work for me, right? And so that's where a lot of people, I think, get confused, where would be the correct term be learned helplessness to an extent of just continuously failing and feeling like you're not getting the results and feeling like, you know what, this won't work for me.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's probably the right framework to put on that. It's almost just a result of like the environment that we have grown up in, right? Like how many people change jobs every 2 years, right? Just trying to like jump the corporate ladder. How many people stick with a sport for most of their adult life, right? How many people stick with a business for more than 4 or 5 years? I mean, even like in the the entrepreneur game is everybody's goal is spend 5 to 7 years building something, sell it, and then move on to the next thing. And like at 5 to 7 years is when you probably really actually start to figure out like, how do you do this repeatably instead of just like, oh, I got lucky and it was timing and it was this random person I met. And so I think like we've just created such a culture of like, that's the way we live. So it's really, and I was thinking about this the other day, just in the terms of my own life of like, I've been playing basketball since I was 10. And obviously like I'm 36 now, so my physical prowess is not what it was at 18, but like I'm a better player now at 36 than I was at 18. I mean, obviously can't jump and run as fast and high, but like if you just keep playing a sport for 25 years, like you're going to be a better player after 25 years than you were at, 10 years in, even if you were at your peak athleticism. And so I think it's just very few people get the compounding effect of life.
Yeah. And you got me thinking about that. NFL Combine was recent and they showed Tom Brady running a faster 40 now at like 36 than what he did. Now, let's be real, like his combine back in the day was terrible. I mean, you can go through and check that out. I mean, I think
set the bar as low as you can, right?
Exactly. And then you'll improve for the next few decades. But like to me, he's actually the perfect example of like, he wasn't a great college quarterback. He obviously was a low draft pick and consistently like getting better. Like he never had the best skill set, doesn't move like Lamar Jackson, doesn't have a cannon like Rodgers, but like he built all these different skill sets and gradually improved and mastered all the details of the game in such a way that he became the best quarterback of all time, or at least the most accomplished quarterback of all time. And now continues to make improvement. Right. And so like, there's kind of this balance, especially in the world of fitness where, at some point, like you're not going to be at what your physiological peak would be. Right. For like a lot of athletes, we're probably talking like 25 to like 28, 29 before we really start to see kind of a drop off. Everyday people, it's somewhat the same way. And we don't realize like how important the things that we're doing early on can build a huge foundation to prevent that decline, but staying consistent through the time periods when life gets a little bit busy and crazy is so important to prevent that decline even further. And if we do it correctly, we can be in better shape because we get better at all the details. Like you might not be as strong in terms of a maximal amount in the gym, but your technique might be better. You're getting a better muscular contraction, or you might not be able to handle the same nutrient variability. You might not be able to go out and get slammed on a Friday and, still be able to perform whatever it is for the next couple of days physically and mentally. But because you've made such improvements in terms of maybe food quality, in terms of eliminating some of the inconsistencies, that you get better results, right? And so it's about focusing on the process and being process driven that can lead a lot of people to radically transform their life.
Yeah. And I think one of the things you said there is super important is we obviously have a short window of our life where we get to be like at peak physical capacity. But what actually matters the most is it really like the 25 to 29 where you're in your physical peak, or is it the 30 to 90 that like actually matters for the largest portion of your life, where you're like trying to raise kids, trying to build businesses, like trying to keep your life on track, trying to, live as long as you can. And that 60 years is really about the habits and behaviors that you adopt and just like continuing to make sure your body is getting the right signals to age well versus like what is your actual physical peak at 27, 28. And I think people obviously, a lot of times they're like, hey, how well can I do in those 4 years versus the 30, 35 years that actually matter the most?
No doubt. And sometimes what it is, it's a difficult time being able to pivot some of your values, action steps, and behaviors to what actually fits where you are now and not hold that standard to where you were when you were 25. That leads a lot of people to do things that frankly can be a little bit destructive. If we're talking like the lifting sense, you can't get away with a lot of the same things, but even nutritionally as well, everything can change inside your body. That's one of the things that we'll get into this shortly. But like, I think a lot of people run into issues nutritionally when they look at things like purely in a vacuum of what worked previously. And even looking at something like a nutrition calculator that gives them a ballpark for calories, but then they treat it as gospel. And not understanding that human metabolism is really a dynamic, ever shifting, ever evolving kind of thing based on the inputs that you're putting in, based on your diet history, based on the foods that you eat, based on your overall stress levels that really determine how well you use those calories and what your metabolic rate actually is compared to, again, what a calculator is going to show on the internet based on a few different variables. And so building that skill set is important. Let me ask you this, right? Because listen, you're a trained scientist. You are an incredibly smart guy. You've seen, how many diets do you think you've looked over with your business right now?
All of them. I think all of them at this point. It's kind of wild. Yeah. Yeah.
And then you're also on the scientific advisory board for the National Academy of Sports Medicine as well. So you see what's going on from the educational front and being brought to the forefront with coaches who are working with people as well. So what I would like to go over with you, like, what are some of the key principles overall? And as we like to say, for looking great naked, I first want to talk about like the overall like aesthetic portion, because there's so many different diets out there. I think distilling things down into clear-cut principles is incredibly important. But then I want to look at the trade-off of health, because there's this interesting balance where people look at things from a performance component and health, and they're not always congruent. And finding that sweet spot is what people need to really look, feel, and perform their best, not just when they're 25, but really for the next 50 years as well.
Yeah. So I think those kind of three things you mentioned, like the health, the aesthetics, the body composition, and the performance they're all related, but they're all very different independent goals, right? If you over-index on one, you kind of lose some of the other, right? You've seen some athletes who, are peak performance and they look great, but like their health is not great. And you've seen, people who, maybe their appearance isn't amazing, but they're incredible athletes, right? They can perform at high levels. So just kind of understanding they're all a little bit different. When we talk about just the aesthetic side of kind of the look good naked piece, is every diet can essentially work for a certain period of time until it stops working, right? And I think that's one of the things that people don't really kind of take into account of, like, that's the reason why you see amazing transformations with basically every diet that has been done, right? You've got the very moderate diets, like the, hey, count your calories diet. You have like hardcore carnivore, dry fasting diets. You have the vegan diets. Like, you have everything across the board. And just from an aesthetics perspective, they can all work for a while until they stop working. And it really just comes down to all of them somehow end up changing your kind of energy balance equation, right? If you're trying to lose weight, you end up being in a calorie deficit, whether it's because you've completely removed like a food group or a macronutrient that basically massively reduces your calorie intake. You've over-indexed on protein, so you just are feeling full all the time, or you've kind of just hampered your ability to eat enough calories because you can only eat so many steaks in a day. Like, something's changed to where you've just changed your normal eating behavior and you're just eating less calories. So that's why all those diets work for a while until they don't. And I think that's the biggest thing that people don't really take into account when they start something is, and there's kind of two perspectives on it. One is, if you go into any sort of dietary approach you have with the mindset of, I'm open to this working until it doesn't, and then change, that's probably okay. I'm sure you've had clients where it's like, hey, we're going to use a fairly extreme approach to get some pretty quick results, as long as this is not the end game of what we're doing, right?
Totally.
Yeah. Or, you've got the other perspective of like, hey, if this is not a long-term solution, I don't even want to start it. And I think both of those are fine. It just depends on what is the conversation you're having with yourself or your clients as you get started. So I think that's a big part of it. The other piece, just to kind of, as we circle that idea, is understanding exactly why what you're doing is working is really important. mostly for like the long-term results of what you're trying to do, right? So if you know, like, let's say you're kind of going with one of these extreme approaches of like, hey, you're going like very low carb ketogenic diets, and you get into your mindset of like, hey, the reason I'm losing weight is because I'm eating low carb, my insulin levels are low, so I'm losing all this weight. The problem with that is, one, it's not true. Two, what happens when your goals in life change and you have to change your diet, right? We've all had clients who it's like, hey, I'm 70 pounds overweight. They lose that weight. They still don't love how they look because they've lost a lot of weight. They look flat. And now they're like, hey, I want to start building some muscle tissue. I want to start like building a physique. But then in their mind, they're still like, well, I have to continue to be on a low carb diet because I'm going to instantly add body fat if I add this back in. But it's like, hey, we're going to have a really hard time training hard, recovering well, building muscle tissue over a 12, 18, 24 month period if we're eating a low carb diet. So you've got to then, kind of untrain the thinking in your clients and things like that. So it's really just making sure you also understand exactly how the diet you're using is working, so you don't get this kind of false sense of why it's working and then what do I have to change in the future.
Yeah, I think there's a natural human tendency to, when something works and it works quickly, it does give us that big dopamine response. And we're like, oh my God, this thing is amazing. And it's what we automatically go back to. And so like low carb is the easiest low hanging fruit that I see here. And low carbohydrate diets, like, listen, I love to start clients with a lower carbohydrate diet. And many times like we'll incorporate some aspects of intermittent fasting as well. And the reason that we like to do is like they see quick results, they feel better. A lot of times inflammation can go down, gut health improves. But as you mentioned, like the important piece here is like, we explain it, this is a short-term thing, right? Like we can't use this tool forever. The longer we use it, the less effective it becomes, right? And like we could go down the rabbit hole in terms of what can happen from a physiological perspective when you've got long, prolonged periods of fasting, dramatically under eating calories and not having carbohydrates and thyroid function and all the different kind of cascading effects that can happen. And I just find it so important to be like, when you understand how to use or why a tool works, it allows you to pull back sometimes from the emotional attachment we get to a certain way of eating. And it allows us to think about, okay, like, yeah, I have this tool. I can use it when that tool is going to be best applied now, but I can also go back to eating in a way that's going to be flexible. As an example, I had a consult with a client yesterday, and she mentioned that her professional life has gotten a lot busier. I mean, she's in great shape. She's a former competitor. I mean, she could still step on stage, right? But her personal life has gotten busier. She's dating, going out to dinner. And it's like, I told her, imagine you have 100 points and you have these three buckets. You have your health, you have your professional life, and you have your personal life. And if these other buckets, these other areas right now are requiring more of your attention, more focus, there's only so much of you. And so you can't hold this expectation of like looking the way that you were on stage and having all those components dialed in when you value these other things more at this different phase. And so I think a lot of times what happens with nutrition and diets is people will attach to like this ultimate physique type idea of what they want to be, or this ultimate health physique, but start to lose sight of these other values. And listen, if I learned anything like over the last 34 years, it's like when we act incongruent with our values, it just erodes our self-confidence and our self-belief. And that's where people get really stuck with some of the nutrition and dietary dogma.
Yeah. And I think that's the point you just mentioned of you have different aspects of your life that at times you're going to index on. And it's okay that those change over time. I mean, I would imagine even you, as a professional in this space, like in the last probably 10, 15 years, you've been married, you've moved, you've had kids, you've built businesses. So like there's probably times where you had to pull points from the fitness bucket and put them in the other buckets, right? Because it's like, that's what my life needs to be. And so that needs, one, that changes over time. And I think two, people need to give themselves that grace and that space to do those things, right? I think a lot of times, our clients often index their life on the day that they looked the best, and they judge themselves from that every single day of their life. And it's like, one, that's not realistic. Two, it's really not super helpful, right? Because I think you're going to age no matter what, right? It's like, hey, I can't index to myself. Like every day I look in the mirror like, hey, what did I look like when I was 22 versus now with like, hey, some more wrinkles, some more gray hair, like, hey, it's going to change. So I think that's one of the big conversations that I'm sure you've had with clients too, is like, as life changes, goals change, and that's fine. And that means our approach changes, and that's fine. And that's exactly what we're here to do, is like, how do we make sure that your goals are in line with your life in total, and not just like, hey, you stepped on stage one time as a fitness competitor, how do we keep you there for the next 25, 30 years? Maybe that is what you want to do, but then you've got to realize the rest of your life is going to look way different.
Yeah, it's always about having that alignment between, again, what's most important for you in the here and now, and making sure that the actions are in alignment with that specifically. I think one of the key things here is like understanding the key principles that are needed when it comes to changing body composition. And so you've looked at so many diets, so much research, literally thousands, probably tens of thousands of clients that have been through based on your work in the past. What are some of the key principles people need to focus on primarily for fat loss? Like, let's keep that as the key focus here.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two main components, and one is obviously being in a calorie deficit over an extended period of time. I think that's obviously the most important. And what I've found really interesting for most people is there's two things that actually help people drive that over long periods of time. One is, how consistent can you be over weeks, months, in a year, right? Can you keep a fairly consistent level of calorie intake over weeks and months? I think a lot of people do really good for a day or two or 5 days, and then their weekends end up just being a mess, or their life gets super busy. They have a death in the family. Like, life is messy. And so I think a lot of times people really struggle with staying consistent when life gets messy over extended periods. And that's just like, how can I eat relatively the same for days, weeks, and months at a time? I think that's the most important thing. I actually think like the exact calorie deficit you have, the exact types of food you eat actually matter a lot less than just being able to like, can I consistently follow a habit and a plan for months at a time? That's the first piece. The second piece is people's physical activity is really underrated for their ability to lose weight. And it's not like the time that they spend at the gym, but it's like the structure of their life does not get enough attention. I mean, I think, the average, let's say, middle-aged person, someone between, 30 and 50, they're in the busy part of their life. The average day looks like get up, go downstairs, grab some coffee, or go in. Maybe you don't have an upstairs, but you go into the kitchen, you make coffee, you eat breakfast, you get in the car, you drive your kids to school, you drive to work, you sit in your office for 8 hours. Maybe if you're lucky, you get to stop at the gym for an hour on the way home. You get home, you cook dinner, you hang out with your kids, you put your kids to bed, you watch an hour of TV, and then you go to bed. It's like you've moved for a total 10 minutes throughout the day, and you've taken 1,500 steps, and maybe you burned an extra 200 calories at the gym. But that makes it almost impossible to lose weight long term, because if you think, let's say you have a client, you put them on a 500 calorie a day deficit, and they lose 20, 30 pounds over, the course of, let's call it 6 months, a year. Well, they can't continue to just eat less, right? But their movement doesn't change. Their life, their structure just changes the same. So at some point, that energy equation just is completely even, and they can't change their life much more. So I think that's the big piece too, is a lot of people's lives just don't change. The structure of it doesn't change. And so that's what makes, I think, the longer term component hard, is how can you change the structure of your life to just be more physically active too?
Yeah, I think that's a huge piece of it, right? I mean, and it's not just about calories in, calories out with that perspective either. I mean, it's like what happens to the efficiency of your cells, like down to the cellular level, right? Like when they're consistently working and having to burn different amounts of fuel, like your little mitochondria become more efficient, right? And so if the powerhouse cells of our body can continue to perform kind of at not a peak, but like a higher level, like over time, it doesn't sound like a big deal, but like over time, it really compounds. And I think when you talk about the classic kind of middle-aged schedule right there, one of the huge issues becomes like, if we're not moving and we're not really even building some of that lean tissue, a lot of times what happens is somebody's like, hey, I just want to stay the same weight that I was. Well, and maybe we go from being 200 pounds and like 15% body fat to like 17 and then 19. And so we have this gradual shift of like losing lean tissue and adding body fat. And it doesn't seem like much over the course of a year or even 2 or even 3. And then you get to the point, it's like, oh, wow, like, my daily calorie expenditure, my insulin sensitivity, like all these other factors that can contribute to an extent are very downregulated, right? And something that happens so gradual, and then all of a sudden, and then you look in the mirror and you're like, oh man, like what happened? Like, how did I get this gut?
Yeah.
And so that's where a lot of people, I think, get stuck, is it's just like a gradual decline. And then it's all of a sudden they feel really dissatisfied with where they're at, or they get a bad health report.
Yeah, it's kind of like the old saying, you go bankrupt slowly than all at once. It's kind of the same thing with your health, is you don't realize what's happening until you wake up one day. And I think one of the things you mentioned there is really important for people to just kind of think about is we're biological organisms. So our body is always adapting to the signals it's given. So if we're giving it no signals, it's going to adapt negatively, right? So it's like, even if the scale weight stays the same, your body's always in a state of change, right? And so it's, what signals are you giving your body to change? Are you telling it needs to have more muscle tissue and more bone density and greater cardiovascular capacity? Or are you telling it every day, like, you know what? We don't really need much. Like, we don't move that much, so we don't need that much skeletal muscle. We don't really carry heavy loads, so we don't need that much bone tissue. We don't really increase our metabolic rate much. So like, I don't really need to be able to handle like large amounts of glucose at a time. Like I don't really get stressed that much. So I'm just going to kind of slowly fall apart. Whereas the other side of that is, even if you're not continuing to lose weight or things like that, or you're not like substantially improving your body composition every day or week or month, is the signals you continue to give your body just cause your body to be more robust over time. And that's really, I think, the biggest thing that people should focus on, especially I think at some point in everybody's journey is weight loss stops becoming the goal, right? At some point it becomes about like, why am I doing this? And it's, how can I just continue to build and maintain the robustness of the one body that I was given? And how can I continue to like improve it? And so I think a lot of times after a certain point, you have to start viewing exercise as like a tool for weight management, and you have to view it as a tool for like, how do I continue to create a body that I want to live in?
Yeah, I think that's a great approach. It's like many times people get started with a journey into fitness because they're dissatisfied with what they see in the mirror or the number on the scale, right? Like a lot of times that's the initial thing. But the people who end up, in my experience, getting the best results and really creating a long-term transformation start to view it as a way to like improve their life from a overall perspective, right? It's like, we always say fitness is a force multiplier, because the habits that you learn and start to develop, you start to learn how they transfer to different areas of your life. When you are improving your health, you're literally improving the functional capacity of every cell inside your body, which is going to give you more focus, more energy. Like, who doesn't want more focus at work and more energy to enjoy life outside of work and exercise and all these different things, right? And so it's like, when we start to look at fitness as a vehicle for a better life, that's what really creates a long-term perspective that really helps drive the consistency that we need across the board. Now, a couple things you got my mind going on, as we're going here. One, we talk about sending signals to the body. What happens when people consistently stay at very aggressive diets for a prolonged period of time? The classic example is you see people following like a finishing diet or an ultra low carbohydrate diet that, might be designed for somebody who's like already very lean. Like, I'm getting ready for a photo shoot. Hey, this is what I do during the final 30 days. I manipulate carbohydrates for like a 30-40% deficit. What happens when people stay on these aggressive measures for too long?
So there's kind of the very short-term adaptations that occur, and then there's kind of the longer-term adaptations. In the short term, things that we see, especially when you adopt either very low-calorie diets or very low-carbohydrate diets, is you see a pretty substantial reduction in sex hormones and thyroid hormones and a few other things, but those are kind of the two primary ones. Those things will actually pretty quickly affect your quality of life, right? Like, your thyroid hormone dropping, you will just feel very low energy, very lethargic, and just, you will not really want to do much with your life at that point, right? So I think that's a big piece. The other piece is, whenever you see declines in sex hormones, obviously drop in sex drive, that's not great. But I think the bigger thing that people don't think about is your ability to recover from the exercise you're doing starts to drop, right? And so now it's like, oh, it takes me 2 or 3 days to recover from training versus 1 or 2. So I'm actually training less, or I feel like trash even after I exercise. So that's the other big one. Those happen fairly quickly. The nice thing is they rebound fairly quickly, right? Is they come back, within a couple of weeks of kind of returning to normal calorie intakes or carbohydrate intakes. The other big change we see is whenever you're in a calorie deficit for an extended period of time, you actually start moving a lot less in your daily life. So there's been a whole bunch of really interesting experiments, and I kind of wish I would have grown up as a scientist in the 90s, because they got to do some really cool stuff. And so they used to take people and they used to put them on like calorie restrictive diets and just like lock them in rooms and just like see what they would do. And what was wild was people just stop like moving. Like they stop fidgeting, they stop pacing, they stop doing any form of like physical movement. And what's really interesting about that is this is why a lot of people, when they start dieting, stop losing weight fairly quickly, right? Like maybe the first couple weeks, and they're like, oh, I'm still eating the same, I'm still going to the gym, but they actually start moving a lot less in their daily life, to the tune of like 5, 6, 7, 800 to 1,000 calories a day of just like physical movement. They move way less. And so when you think about what that does is, one, that's obviously quality of life, right? Two, now all of a sudden you've kind of gotten into this cycle of nothing I'm going to do works, right? You're like, oh, I've dieted. I've gone from 2,500 calories a day to 1,500 calories a day. I lost 6 pounds and now I can't lose any more. But like, is that person really, should they go to 1,000 calories a day to lose weight? Probably not. But they don't think that they've changed much, but they have. And so that's the other big thing, is you kind of just see this drop in like efficacy of what's working, and you don't realize what's happening in your own life. So that's the other thing that actually happens fairly quickly, within like days or weeks of adopting kind of lower calorie diets. The longer term piece is, what's really interesting is we don't have a ton of great hardcore research on very long term calorie restriction, mostly just because it's really hard to keep people in very low calorie intakes for extended periods of time. And like research studies, the ethics boards are probably like, we can't starve people for 4 years and see what happens. But we do have some really good insights. What we primarily see is on the psychology of food side. People start to hyperfixate on food the longer that they diet. That was one of the most interesting things that they found in that original kind of semi-starvation study that was done in the 1940s, is months of like pretty severe calorie restriction, people just start to like over-index their life on food. And so that's a really common thing that we see, right? Especially clients who've spent, I'm sure you've had this, you get clients who come to you who are like, oh, I've been dieting since I was 12.
Yeah.
Right? And like their entire life is about food and managing food, and they think about food all the time. And so that's a big piece of it. The other piece is people start to not understand their own body's signals of like hunger, satiety, things like that. It starts to get a little dysregulated of like, am I actually hungry or am I just like craving food? And so those things start to become kind of decoupled from your body's physiology. And so it's not easy to just naturally control your own intake. And then the very last thing that happens is actually what people think happens first, is you get a reduction in your like metabolic rate, right? Your actual like resting metabolism, when you have kind of extreme dieted for probably 6 to 12 months, starts to go down a little bit. And it's about, let's call it 5 to 10%. So if your normal basal metabolic rate was 1,500, it's probably down to like 1,350, 1,400, even if you weigh the same. So you do get a slight reduction in your metabolic rate, but it's all those other things that actually really affect your long-term kind of metabolism, nutrition, behaviors, things like that.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? And I think it happens gradually, then all of a sudden. And when we stop doing the things that are basically going to support optimal health and growth or the maintenance of certain tissues, your body's going to get rid of them. I think that's why it's so important to have a process-driven approach. So like, what are the daily action steps I need to be able to take? And, an example is a 10,000 step count. Again, there's, whether you like the idea of 10,000 steps or not, like how much of it's just like, marketing versus what's actually going to be magical. Being able to have a small metric like that can be just a great way to track like, how much am I moving? Am I behind my desk and getting 2,000 steps a day? Or am I moving around a little bit more and keeping that like 6,000 or 8,000? And so looking at a basic metric like that for daily movement, not necessarily using it as like, oh my God, I have to hit like 10,000 steps or my day's a failure, but like just as an overall eye on like what your activity is like, can be a really powerful way, especially when you're dieting down, to keep track of what that movement looks like.
Yeah, it's the analogy I tell clients all the time is think about it like your bank account, right? If you check your bank account every day, you're probably going to be more conscious about how you spend money than if you haven't checked your bank account in 20 years, right? Or your credit card balance. But like the same thing with your steps is, hey, if we're tracking it every day, the likelihood of you going 3 or 4 days moving 1,500 steps a day is much lower. But if you never track your steps, the likelihood of that happening just because life gets busy and you're at the airport and you're traveling and you've had a long road trip with the family, like that's probably going to happen because you're not just paying attention to it.
Yeah, there's kind of this balance, right? It's like we have so many different ways that we can track and record data. And I know you love data. I like having data. And I always like to say like data directs decisions and eliminates drama, because does it tell you everything? Does it apply context? Not always, but I don't know how many people come in. Like we have so many conversations with people who join us, people who don't join us. And they're like, I've tried everything. It doesn't work. My metabolism has slowed down. I'm like, totally get it. Like, have you done blood work? No. Okay. Like, how many calories are you eating? Like, I have no idea. I don't want to track. It's too much work. Right. And so sometimes what it is like things that we track and pay attention to, that's what we can really optimize. And it's really hard to improve something if we don't have any baseline information. And like one of the things I tell people is, you don't have to track calories forever, but you should track calories in everything you eat for 30 days once in your life, because you're going to learn more than any like nutrition book that you can really go through based on portion sizes, based on what's unique to you, and make improvements from there. So I think it's like the importance of like not getting so bogged down in your own data that it drives you neurotic, but like objectively getting information so you can make better informed and directed decisions and not more or less kind of like fall prey to some of the shitty marketing that's out there in regards to fitness and nutrition, where it's like, hey, nope, it's your hormones because you're eating carbohydrates. I think that's one of the battles.
Yeah. One of the most interesting things that's just I've learned over the years of working with clients is having objective measures of your own behaviors can be really uncomfortable, right? A lot of times people just don't like seeing what things actually look like from an objective standpoint, right? It's sort of like, imagine if you were to like every day at the end of the day, like go to your wife and ask her like, I need you to give me objectively like everything that I did today that annoyed you. And like, imagine if you just had to hear that every single day of like every negative thought that ever went through her head. It'd be like, man, I don't like this at all. And then probably after like 6 months, you'd be like, okay, this is just the process. I think a lot of times people feel the same way about data the first time they see it about themselves, especially if they have kind of started the journey with a narrative of, I've tried everything, it hasn't worked, something's broken about me, right? And then the first couple of weeks they see, oh, actually, this is what my behaviors look like objectively. Like, this is really uncomfortable. And I think that's where a little bit of the art of coaching really comes in, of like, how do you manage those conversations and how do you kind of work through some of those things of like, hey, this is not a reflection of you as a person. Like, all we're doing is quantifying what's currently working or not working and then just trying to make some changes. But I do think it can be really uncomfortable at times when people first start to see like, oh, okay.
Yeah. Look, if any of us pull up our finances and it's like, oh, wow, I have 5 different TV subscriptions. Is that really in alignment with like how I want to spend my money when I've got $100 a month going out for all these different things? Like, maybe not necessarily. Right. And so I think sometimes it's like, it's not a personal attack. It's just objective data. And the one thing I see a lot is people like say track the nutrition Monday through Friday, and then they won't track on the weekend because they want to avoid seeing what that number says, like that objective feedback of like, shit, like, maybe I shouldn't have, ate and drank X, Y, and Z amount. And again, it's not a personal indictment, but it's objective, because if we know what that data is, it's like, then if you're working with a coach or somebody directly, they can work on fitting some of these things in you might enjoy, because if you can't stay consistent, nothing else matters. But like, we still need to have the overall physiological thing that we're trying to accomplish get done. Now, one thing I want to ask you about is like, how important do you view it for someone to have their diet working in concert with like their styles of training? As an example, low carbohydrate diets, still a craze. I thought this like kind of thing would fade out, but it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And then like a lot of high intensity exercise, particularly when you have people who are high intensity exercise, low carbohydrate diet, maybe prolonged periods of fasting, and a high stress lifestyle. Like, what does that do for people metabolically? Like, should it be higher carbohydrates at different points based on activity? What does that look like?
It works until everything breaks, right? And that's what we see. Our bodies are pretty resilient up to a point, and then it's like, I can't handle this anymore. And so we see that a lot with, this was basically the prototypical client between 2011 and 2014, probably, when like CrossFit and paleo was all the rage. Is like,
totally.
People would start doing CrossFit, they'd go low carb, they would lose a lot of weight really quickly, things were fine, and then all of a sudden everything started to fall off the rails. And what was happening is they were getting a little bit metabolically healthier because they were losing weight. They were starting a new form of exercise where their capacity was still relatively low, so their total training volume was relatively low, like in the grand scheme of things. And so it was great. But then at some point, their training volume started to increase. They started to go to CrossFit instead of 2 days a week. It was 5 days a week. They were now training for 2 hours a day. And your body cannot handle that, right? At some point, it's like, I'm not giving it the fuel it needs to complete the exercise. So I start borrowing from my muscle tissue. I'm not recovering. I'm relying pretty heavily on cortisol to break down tissue, to like provide carbohydrates. So everything starts to kind of fall apart. What was really interesting is around this time is there was also some professional athletes who started to kind of go into the low carb phase. Specifically, just because I'm a basketball person, is LeBron had a season where he did this. And if you watched his body, it was fine the first part of the season, but he continued to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And at some point, like, his body started to break down. So he had to kind of change what he was doing. So these approaches can work for short periods of time until they really stop working. And it's more of your body is a master compensator rather than this is the ideal way to do it, right? It's kind of like when you have an injury, you can still play, but you're going to compensate. And then eventually, you know, you're going to end up with another injury because you've been overcompensating. And so we see the same thing when your diets are not matching what you're asking of your body. And so when we have like high training volumes, high intensity, and we're not matching it with the appropriate nutrition, we really start to see things fall apart after a while. And what's really interesting is I think people know this intuitively, right? Because we see this on the other side of the equation, where what happens when you overfeed your body and you're not using it? The same thing happens, right? Is metabolic issues start happening. You start adding weight. You start to have insulin resistance. You start to have high blood pressure. Like, it's in the opposite direction. And so it's interesting that we intuitively know these things, but we don't want to acknowledge it until we actually have a pretty major problem. Yeah,
no doubt. And again, I think so much of it comes down to like, we have the recency bias of how well something worked and just wanting it to continue. And, you know, it's like, yeah, you mentioned like some of the metabolic things and like some of the red flags that I look for when we have our check-ins with our clients. Like, we're asking each week about sleep, stress, hydration, digestion, and like looking at these other cues that can start to be indicators of like, okay, your body's starting to fight maybe against what we're currently doing, right? Whether it's building muscle or losing body fat, because when we can step back and look at kind of the responses our body's giving us into cues, we start to build this awareness of like, okay, this is how it can auto-regulate and adjust here. Like, I'm not getting as much sleep, carbohydrates have been lower. Like, maybe I need to make a couple adjustments, you know, based on my timing or like what my intake is. And like, when you start to develop this skill set by observing your body and through the biofeedback that it's giving you, instead of just, you know, white knuckling everything and being a hammer and a nail, it starts to develop that like intuitive sense where you can really develop a sustainable long-term approach.
Yeah, I think you brought up a really good point there. Is our bodies give us a ton of signals before things actually really start to go wrong. I think we just are not great at listening to them, right? Especially because we live in a world where you don't have to listen to it, right? Like, if you're tired, drink more coffee. If you're stressed, sit on the couch and watch Netflix. You know, if your body hurts, take some Advil and go get a massage. If you are like experiencing some issues, like health issues, it's go to the doctor and they're going to give you some sort of medication to manage it. We live in a world where we can just kind of put a Band-Aid over issues instead of actually being like, oh, what is this actually telling me that I need to change? And so that I think that's such an interesting aspect of just the world we live in, is we don't listen to the signals that our body's telling us. We just try to slap a Band-Aid on it as fast as we can.
Yeah. It's like ignoring that check engine light in the car. You're like, next week, next week. Oh, $3,000 down the drain later on with an unplanned expense.
And see, this is a great analogy of like between the, let's just say, average person and like a professional athlete. Like, if you jump in a Ferrari and you see a check engine light, you're immediately taking it to the mechanic, because you're like, if I don't fix this, I'm going to end up with a $200,000 transmission change, right? But if you're driving around your 200,000 mile Honda Civic and you see the check engine light, you're like, meh, I'll take it in maybe in like 10 years. And I think like the average person who is, you know, driving the Honda Civic, of like, we can function, like we can live our lives with the check engine light on for years, and we just don't think about it.
Yeah. Injuries are a really, really simple way to think about it, right? And like, who hasn't had like a shoulder issue or like a tight back? And it's like, you know, these are all little signals. And like, as a shoulder example, like, yeah, your shoulder hurts every time you bench, and you like to bench though. So like, yeah, I'll just keep working through it. And then all of a sudden, like, yeah, like I can't extend my arm out, like I can't pick up my kid. Like, oh, okay. Like now we've got a shoulder replacement problem. So like effectively, both from a training perspective and like a nutrition perspective, it's like listening to those cues, and it doesn't mean you have to like change everything you're doing when you feel one of these cues, but like just be aware of like what the overall trends are and think, how can I improve this? Because this is trying to tell me something. And so sometimes it's like not consuming more information and trying to do things dramatically different. It's like, look at what you're doing right now and where can you improve based on these other factors? Because where I see people get most confused is there is such a wealth of information and knowledge in the overall health, fitness, wellness type space that people now have a ton of education, a ton of surface level knowledge, but what's often lacking is like the wisdom for what applies when and how we apply things. And like, that's a really difficult thing to explain. And it's also something that takes a lot of time and patience to develop.
Yeah, I almost think clients and people get too much information. I think a lot of it just comes down to how well can you execute the most basic ideas that you get, right? I think this applies. I mean, I know that for me in like the business side, this has also been one of the more difficult but highest ROI things is like, do I really need to read another book or do I just need to get to work? Right. And I think with our clients too is as a coach, sometimes it's less about education and more about just like, how can we continue to find ways to lower the barriers so you can do what you need to do? Like you already know what you need to do. I don't think I really need to send you another article on intermittent fasting or metabolic adaptation. Or it's like, hey, we've had this conversation before. It's like, how do we just structure your life so you can make better choices this week? And I think that's a big part of it is I think we think we need more information when we in reality just need to continue to do what we need to do.
So many times that's the case. It's putting the foot to the pavement, so to speak, is what we need to actually drive results in the right direction. Now, you are deep in the science, but you're also a business owner, an entrepreneur with multiple different businesses and interests. Like, how do you personally manage so many demands on your schedule with your personal life, with your professional life, and with staying healthy?
A very understanding spouse. That's the first thing.
That helps. Makes a big difference.
Yeah. I think the other thing is just not losing sight on what actually matters at the end of the day, is make sure that you take care of yourself and your body first. That always has to come first. You can always rebuild another business. You can always do whatever those things, but like you only get the one body you live in. So make sure that like that is functioning properly. Kind of like you mentioned earlier is just knowing that there's seasons, right? And there's times where there's going to be days where you have to over-index on certain things and just being okay with, hey, today's one of those days where I'm going to end up working 16, 18 hours. I'm not going to stress about it. I'm not going to get super worked up that, hey, I had to order in lunch today versus make a homemade lunch. Like I'm doing the things I need to do 90% of the time, like the couple days here and there. That's another piece of it. And then I think the last piece is just really enjoying the process. And I think that's the biggest part of like, I'm sure we've all had very long days where we hated every second of it. And we've had very long days where we've loved every second of it. Is how can you make the mental choice to just try to enjoy it at all times, even when it's not great. And I think that's been a big part of it is like, this is just the process of life and acknowledging like, hey, I've made all the decisions that have put all the things on my schedule today that I have to do. So this is 100% on me. And so I think just taking ownership on it's also super helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the last thing is take your work seriously, but don't take yourself seriously. That's also the big thing of like, hey, it's work. I'm super professional. I work my butt off. These things matter to me. But also at the end of the day, it's like, I'm still me. I'm not going to get super stressed out about everything. It's like, just enjoy it, be who you are, and kind of let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah, I think that's such an important piece, and like not attaching your identity so much to your career or even your body. I think that's something that we see a ton of times. I mean, I've been guilty of it too. It's like if something doesn't go well at 100%. Work and you carry it home, like that's not a fun spot to be for anybody involved, right? And so it's about developing that perspective. Something that had helped me, I've heard Joe Rogan allude to this before, but it's like at the end of the day, it's like we're all a bunch of chimpanzees floating on a giant rock through space, right? Yep. And so kind of looking at it from that perspective of like everything could change in an instant, like it's a miracle that we're even here, like that can allow you to have a little bit more fun in the process as well. Brad, would love to do a quick rapid fire session with you, about 15, 20 seconds per answer. You ready?
Yes.
All right. You're playing basketball, training in the gym. You've got one song to listen to. What are you going with? Or one artist?
Oh man, Drake.
Good choice. What song?
I honestly don't know. I just put it on Pandora and then don't even look at the song titles.
Just gonna go 0 to 100. That's what we're going with. Love it. All right. Favorite book?
My favorite book is, oh man, this is tough. Probably How to Win Friends and Influence People. That's up there.
Great book. Favorite supplement for overall health and wellness for the average person?
Vitamin D.
Love it. How much?
2 to 5,000 I use a day.
Awesome. All right. You're on death row. Not going to say why, but you get one meal. What is that last meal going to be?
Do I get like the full meal or just one food?
Dude, I mean, we're talking appetizers, we're talking drinks, whatever you want. You're dying, so it doesn't really matter if it's healthy.
Yeah. Man, I got to put like a burger and fries on there. I have to put ice cream and a waffle cone on there. Man, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. You know, that would do it for me.
Hey.
That's like the ideal, especially when it's like summer out, you've had like a day on the lake and you're like, I haven't eaten all day, so I'm just going to go crush a burger, fries, and get a waffle cone. Like that is peak living right there. That
is peak living. Tell you, one of my non-negotiables every week is I do ice cream with my daughter. You know, I'm like, man, hard to beat ice cream, you know? So got to enjoy that. All right.
Yep.
Best piece of advice to somebody who's trying to stay consistent with their nutrition.
Single best piece of advice. You have to make a decision about what you eat. Why not make it a good decision?
Great perspective. If you were trying to build muscle, how many meals per day would you be eating?
At least 5.
Would you change that for fat loss?
Yes.
How many would you eat for fat loss?
2.
Is that for personal satiety or is it measure of calorie control? Bit of both?
For the muscle gain it's to get enough calories in, you just have to eat all the time. For the weight loss is, I think the less frequently you eat, the easier it is to control your calorie intake.
I agree. Like one reason I enjoy intermittent fasting for fat loss in some cases, and the last thing I would want to do when it comes to building muscle, because I'm not going to make the one thing that much harder. In today's modern NBA, LeBron or MJ?
LeBron.
1995, old school, rough and tumble NBA. Who you taking?
LeBron.
Yeah, just a monster. Yep. Yeah, I always get interested in that agreement. Like, dude, he is the freak of freaks. He's 6'5", 260, and can still do like a 360 windmill probably at 39 years old.
I mean, the thing is, like, guys in the NBA in the 90s weighed like 25 to 30 pounds less than they do now. Like, it would just be a massacre.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like people don't consider the difference. Like people would adapt to the different physicality of a game, much like they do. Everything runs cyclical. I always think the NFL as well. Like, yeah, cool. Like now we're spread things out. Now we're gonna see a return to power offense. Like the athletes will adjust, but as the science and development of people continues to grow, it's a pretty big gap. It really is from that performance, component. Awesome, Brad. Hey, this has been a fantastic discussion. Where can we find out more about you?
You can find out about our coaching company at macrosinc.net. You can, if you just Google me, you can find me. I've written stuff everywhere for NASM to muscle and strength for Legion Athletics. Wrote a couple articles for T Nation way back in the day. So I'm kind of all over the place. You can check out my podcast at My Take. Those are probably the places to find me.
Awesome. Brad, thank you so much, man. We'll catch you in the next one.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Eric. It was great to be here and great to reconnect with you.
Yeah, likewise.
Hey, it's Eric here again. Now, there are 3 ways that I can help you look great naked. Number 1, if you want to grab a free copy of the Look Great Naked protocol to help you lose body fat without counting calories, then go to bachperformance.com/free training. Number 2, if you're a busy guy looking to build muscle, then I recommend checking out our Minimalist Muscle Blitz, which has helped over 1,000 men build muscle without living in the gym. Just go to minimalistmuscleblitz.com. The link will also be available in the show notes. Or number 3, and last, if you want to work with me directly and get the best results possible, apply at bachperformance.com/coaching to look great naked without living in the gym. Until next time, my friend,